Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by WealthManagement.com Senior Editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of WealthManagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning issues, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that could just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. To learn more about estate planning and how you can better serve your clients, visit wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our monthly journal features tax law updates, wealth planning, retirement planning, and much more, written by thought leaders in the industry. That's wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Now, our guest this week is Oliver Pursche. Oliver is a senior vice president and advisor at Wealthspire Advisors, and it's a Westport, Connecticut office. His clients are mostly wealthy families or entrepreneurs with complex tax, estate, and wealth transfer concerns who need a multifaceted professional to coordinate matters with their attorneys, accountants, and other professionals to ensure they make smart financial decisions. Thanks so much for joining us, Oliver.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here.
And the subject of our episode today is Leonard Lauder. Now, we may not have heard of Leonard, but he's the billionaire son and heir of cosmetics demigod Estee Lauder, and he passed in mid-June of this year. More accurately, really, though, we'll be focusing on his massive art collection and his generous philanthropy. Leonard was a major art collector. He began by buying Art Deco postcards when he was 6, which I guess is not the most relatable thing for most people, but when you're a super rich kid, then yeah, Art Deco postcards. But his particular focus was on the works of cubist masters Picasso, Braque, Gris, Leger. He also collected Klimt. And much of his art comes from some of the world's most celebrated collections, including those of Gertrude Stein, Swiss banker Raoul Laroche, and British art historian Douglas Cooper. Leonard was a major benefactor of the Whitney Museum of American Art, of which he eventually served as chairman. He donated both money and many works, and was the museum's most prolific fundraiser. His 2008 donation of $131 million is the largest in the museum's history. Additionally, as a longtime supporter of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, Lauder led the creation of a research center for modern art at the museum, which he helped support through a $22 million endowment. And in April 2013, he promised his collection of 81 pieces of cubist art, consisting of 34 Picassos, 17 Braques, 15 Legers, and 15 Grises, to the museum. Together, they are valued at more than $1 billion. It's been described as, without a doubt, the most important collection any private person has put together in many, many years. And now that Lauder has passed, the museum stands to collect on what would be maybe the largest gift in its history. Oliver, though it's safe to say few advisors rub shoulders with clients possessing collections like Lauder's, your wealthy families are more and more often treating fine art and other collectibles as core parts of their balance sheets. What techniques could advisors use and what pitfalls should they avoid when dealing with the ownership and, perhaps more importantly, eventual transfer of such valuable items?
Well, it's a full question with, a week's worth of answers. I think the first thing I would say to any advisor who is thinking about focusing on ultra-high net worth families with significant collections, whether they're pieces of art, bottles of fine wine, watches, cars, whichever, is you have to really understand the space. Mm-hmm. And it's not just understanding the worth of the collection, but understanding what is driving the desire to have that collection. Because if you can't do that, it's really difficult to connect with an individual, with a family that has so much. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, unlike other investments and other items on your balance sheet, art and collectibles are typically driven by a passion, right? And if there's no shared passion, it's really tough to connect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think not all of these collectors are created equally either, right? Where, the urge to collect can manifest itself in many ways. Some people just want to possess as much as they can. Others have more focused interests. Others like to sort of churn through pieces and constantly evolving the collection and moving on from something to get something else. So, finding out sort of how your client collects is an important aspect of this as well.
Yeah. And then, look, we all want, we all want fewer, wealthier clients in this business. Right? That's nirvana. But, it comes with a responsibility. And I've been doing this for 30 years, and the vast majority of advisors that I've ever met, or investment professionals, insurance professionals, are highly ethical and really want to serve their clients extremely well. So, it comes with a lot of responsibility. And I think one of the pitfalls is to say, oh, great, I can do that. I took an art history class in college and I liked it, and therefore I can. You've got to develop a real expertise, and you can't be afraid or bashful in reaching out to other subject matter experts who know more than you. You have to be willing to take a back seat on some things. I work with a couple of very large families who have significant art collections, and I defer to their art consultants on valuations, on trends, on things that they know about far better than I ever will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up, right? Where if a wealthy client is coming to you with a developed collection of sort of, of a popular sort of type of item, like you said, wine or fine art or cars, it's likely that they already have their own people who are sort of experts in the area. They're pretty highly unlikely not to come with you with nothing and then sort of drop it into your lap. So liaising with their expert, right? I mean, even in the case of Leonard Lauder, he didn't, even though he was a lifetime collector, he had a separate professional curator who we paid to curate his collection.
Yeah. And, there's a huge difference let's just stick with art for a moment as opposed to wine or watches or cars. But there's a huge difference in an artist who is still creating, still painting or sculpting and producing new works, as opposed to an artist who is passed and it's a finite amount of things that are available by that artist. Right? So that's a nuance that's really important to understand when communicating with that family and when thinking about the estate planning, when thinking about the value and potential value of the art. An artist who is passed may have peaked in terms of valuation of their creations, their paintings, their sculptures. But a living artist, you may have purchased something for $200,000 that 20 years from now could be worth $20 million. Mm-hmm. There's no way of knowing. It could also just still be worth 200 or less. But kind of understanding those nuances and having a focus on understanding those minute details is really important, because if you're unable to have that conversation, if you're unable to think it through in that manner, which comes typically, in my experience, from somebody who simply doesn't understand, know, or care about the space, which there's nothing wrong with. I mean, there's things in the world that I don't care about, and don't interest me. That's every human being out there. But specifically when it comes to art and collectibles, you've got to have a certain passion for it. And it better be more than, well, I enjoy a good bottle of wine like everybody else, or, oh, wow, that's a pretty old Ferrari. I'd like to have that.
So, yeah, you don't have to be supportive of the collection, but you at least have to have respect.
Respect and an understanding. Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned...
Otherwise, why would they hire you if it's about that?
if you're just going to judge them because they collect toys or something.
Yeah.
You mentioned, I think, the word value, and I think that's where, especially in the sort of the pitfalls area, and I guess a lot of the techniques in sort of avoiding said pitfalls, they all center around value and valuation. So do you mind just talking about some of what goes into valuing these pieces and why that's important?
I mean, there's kind of, in the art world in particular, when it comes to paintings and sculptures, but let's just call paintings because it's easier to visualize. There's a reference to three different kinds of value. So there's the fair market value, which is basically, David, if you had a piece of art and you needed to sell it now, you've got a liquidity issue and you want to sell it, today. And that's kind of, let's call it, $80,000 for the piece. The market value, which is if you want to sell it, but you're willing to take your time, there's no, particular rush, is probably about $100,000 on that. And, the insurance value, which will greatly depend on whether the artist is alive or dead and how much they've produced, is typically 20% above that. So $120,000. So you've got three different values. And that ties into estate planning significantly. Because the IRS doesn't care what it is. The IRS cares that it's an asset that's got X value. Typically, they use the fair market value, which is the lowest of the three, from trying to calculate the tax and the impact on the estate perspective. But that's a big swing, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you think in terms of a piece is 80,000 or 120,000, that's a 50% delta. And that goes into succession planning. That goes into, especially if, and Mr. Lauder had a couple of children and a number of grandchildren. If you pass it on to the next generation or to the generation thereafter, and it's $100 million Picasso, but you want your three grandchildren to have it equally, to jointly own it. What kind of structure do you put it in? Is it an LLC? Where does it get housed? There's a lot of little nuances that you really have to think about, and understanding the value of the piece, and specifically the monetary value as opposed to the emotional value, is the first step in doing so. Absolutely. I think, it's easy to get caught up when we're talking about estate planning. And thinking of things as like on death or like, death tax and all these like sort of death related things, when sort of really what estate planning about is transfer. So these rules apply to sort of in different ways to any and all transfers. So, planning to hand to give something when you die it's different than planning to give it away, but it's the same sort of ideas and techniques sort of apply. Not directly, but sort of, a gift and a bequest sort of, they work differently, but they're both transfers. And so they're both taxed as such. Yeah. And the one kind of nuance to it as opposed to another asset is odds are if you've got, three children, odds are one is going to care emotionally about the collection and art far more than another. Right? Like my experience has been when there's 2 or 3 or 4 kids, there's one that's very passionate and shares the same passion as the parents. Another 1 or 2 that are just like, oh yeah, this is nice. Like I'm into it. I like it. Whatever. Right. And the 3rd or 4th that couldn't give a damn. Right. It's just not their thing. I mean, if that's a $10,000 coin collection, then it's probably no big deal. But if it's an $100 million art collection, you got a problem. Yeah. Or if it's a multi-billion-dollar art collection. So you have to kind of just, you have to kind of just understand that. And how do you, because we as advisors, right, it's not about you should buy this stock or sell that bond or even asset allocation anymore. It's about giving impactful advice and guiding families through complexities that in some cases they haven't thought about and don't realize. So you have to be a psychiatrist as much as anything else. And having those conversations with the family, talking to the parents, to the eventual grantors, and saying like, hey, Susie doesn't care. How do we, make sure that she's made whole? Especially if the art collection takes up a significant amount of the balance sheet, especially after accounting for the death tax / estate tax. Mm-hmm. Right? You've got a $500 million family that's got a $200 million art and real estate collection and $300 million in, marketable securities. Well, they're potentially faced with a $200 and something million tax, which you say, well, you got $500 million. What do you care? I say, well, yeah, hold on a second though. That only leaves $100 million of investable assets there after the tax is paid. How do you split that? How do you make people whole? How do you address it? You want to avoid fire sales, obviously.
Yeah, or forced sales, yeah. That's, I think, one of the interesting aspects, too. You mentioned, $300 million in securities versus $300 million in fine art, which could be, what is this? The Lauder collection was like 45 pieces or something. It's like, it's much easier to break up those millions of stock certificates evenly than it is to sort of chop up.
Yeah, I don't care which 100 shares of NVIDIA stock you give me. They're all the same.
It's like, I don't want, you can't give me the bottom half of the Picasso, right? Like it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Sorry. And so, it just comes down to, we're all smart, we're all capable, we're all well educated, and we can all, take advantage of all the resources that are out here, including, this podcast. But, having a desire to learn about it and thinking about like what can go wrong, and go wrong not from an investment perspective, but from a family dynamics perspective is incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, I always joke, basically every episode of this podcast, I joke that I should just rename it the Communications Podcast.
Yeah.
Because like the answer to every problem basically comes down to like, talk to your clients, talk to their kids, make sure they talk to their kids. But like people are, especially in an estate planning context, I think, financial advisors especially are a little reticent to do it, because it can get very personal. And then some financial advisors aren't, they're still haven't wrapped their head around the whole holistic thing and they're a little uncomfortable doing that. And I think families can still be uncomfortable about it because it's ghoulish, if you're not used to dealing with this sort of thing. Like, I'm an estate planning attorney by trade, so it doesn't bother me, but, someone who doesn't deal with this, to ask them like, hey, tell mom which one of your pictures you want when she's dead. It's like, well, I don't want to talk about that.
It's an unpleasant conversation.
It's a very mercenary conversation. It feels like,
Well, and David, the other part is like, I'm going to be 55 years old, right? A 26-year-old son or daughter of a client or grandson or granddaughter of a wealthy client isn't necessarily looking at me and saying, ooh, this is who I want to hang out with and talk to.
Yes.
Right? Like, that's a problem. And God forbid, and our president, Eric Zontak, actually did a great interview about this. God forbid it's a 32-year-old married person and all of a sudden you're asking your spouse to deal with the in-laws advisor.
Yeah.
Like, talk about a turnoff. So,
and that's assuming the in-laws like the spouse and they don't want
Exactly.
Well, I don't want her to get the picture or whatever. Like it turn into, that whole situation.
Yeah. So,
like, I only want my child to be the owner of this piece when I held it on. I don't want the spouse at all.
Well, and actually that's a really good point, David. Like one of the things that I've experienced over my career in working with families with significant collections is tastes change. Mm-hmm. And so you can't just have that conversation once and think that you're fine and done, right? Like what a 22-year-old thought was a great painting or great sculpture that they absolutely wanted may not be important to them at age 32.
Yeah.
And so the personal tastes evolve and change, and that impacts, the bequesting of anything. And of course, the other part is, especially with art and collectibles, where it's not quite as visible in terms of valuation as you might find, well, in stocks and bonds, obviously, but even with real estate, where you tend to have a pretty good feel for what it's worth. Even if you just use Zillow as a benchmark, you're probably not that far off. Art valuations can fluctuate wildly very, very quickly. And so what you thought was worth $10 million, a year ago, may be worth 6 or 16 today.
Mm-hmm. that's the issue. You're dealing with a lot of things that are, one of one in this space. I mean, obviously there's prints which are numbered, I understand, but for the most part, these big ticket items are one of one, and the only time they get valued is when they get sold, and that happens twice a century.
But those are the little nuances that I think screw people up, and where you can add as an advisor a huge amount of value.
Yeah. I'd be remiss not to mention this because my wife is an art lover and also the son of a daughter of a tax attorney, sorry. And, she loves this case. There was, years ago, I believe it was a Rauschenberg, that incorporated a golden eagle that he had found already dead into the piece. And, when he died, the IRS stuck like a $450 million valuation on it. Because it's like, oh, it's an unseen Rauschenberg, and this thing is super valuable. But because of the Endangered Species Act, you can't sell it because it has an endangered species on it. So it's illegal to sell anything that uses like a part of, endangered species, deceased or otherwise. So they were saying the fair market value was 400 something million, and the family was saying, well, there is no fair market value because we can't legally sell this anywhere. So it's like, what do we do? The black market value? Like, what do we do here? So it's like one of my favorite examples. Like, it's a ridiculous example, but it sort of shows how off the rails this can get.
But less dramatically, I forget the case exactly, but the family went through and they hired a valuation expert on the art collection and all that. The IRS disputed the valuation that came up with. Ultimately, the family prevailed because the valuation expert missed one of the credentials that the IRS requires. Right? Like, they have this list of things that you need, much like, you can't call yourself a financial planner if you don't have your CFP. Right? Like, being aware of that is incredibly important, because you might try to do everything right for the client. But let me tell you something. If they get slapped with a $200 million tax bill that they weren't expecting, there is no making up for that.
Yeah, they're not your client anymore.
No. And you may have additional problems.
So I think it's interesting because we started with, trust the experts. But here we say, trust the experts, but not too much. Make sure they're,
Well, trust the experts.
That doesn't mean do nothing. That means, do your due diligence to make sure that they are the experts. That's part of your job too.
Well, and this person was an expert. He didn't have that one criteria that the IRS requires to accept valuations from an IRS perspective, right? Like, museums have used this individual and to value pieces. So, and they weren't even disputing the work he did. They were just saying it's not a valid valuation because,
it's a technicality,
of this technicality. I kind of think of it, since we're in the middle of the summer and it's, the boys of summer are playing baseball. I think of it as being a GM, right? I don't have to be the hitting coach. I don't have to be the pitching coach. I don't have to know how to pitch or to hit. But I better know enough about each position and what the pitching coach needs to do and what the hitting coach needs to do to be able to pick the right ones and understand what they need to do and the background they need to have to be successful. Right? It's the same thing here as an advisor.
It's so
I
funny.
don't have to be a valuation expert.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazingly funny that you put it that way, because a lot of times when people ask me about this show, and they're like, what I'm trying to accomplish with it. And I tell them, I say, I'm not trying to teach advisors how to do estate planning. They don't need to know how to draft documents. That's ridiculous. They just need to know enough to recognize when it's time to call in an expert.
Yeah.
And so you just need enough knowledge to realize, there is a problem. Let me find, because if you don't know enough to even identify the problem, then what are you going to do?
Yeah. I mean, or have enough intuition and kind of experience. Say, I think this could be a problem. I'm not sure that it's wrong. I'm not sure that it's right. So let me call somebody and find out. So, which, especially with new relationships, or when you're trying to, quote unquote, close the client and have, turn them from a prospect to a client, can be difficult for some, right? Because it's an ego check.
Yeah. I mean, when you're trying to close a relationship like that, I mean, have you even found out necessarily about the collection at that point?
Yes.
Yes, generally?
Yeah, generally speaking, when it's I have one prospect, she's a single woman, but she's, has a significant collection. While I don't know all of the details, I know the size of the collection. I understand kind of the general makeup of it. I understand her overall net worth picture, liquidity issues. We've had some family discussions. She has an adopted son in terms of, what her wishes and what her needs are. And I've identified some issues that she hadn't contemplated. Mm-hmm. And that's what's driving the process forward. We're not at a point yet where I think she's prepared to say here, but we are starting to get down. And one of the things that, and I'm not going to turn it into a commercial about Wealthspire, but one of the things that's very unique about our firm is, I can charge a consulting fee to an individual like that without there being any assets under management. Right? And so being able to say, hey, I'm going to come in here. Let's really peel the onion. Let me sit down. And I've spoken to her accountant. I've spoken to her bill pay person. So I've got a pretty good picture of what her financial life looks like. Generally speaking, at some point of doing all that work, we as advisors have to say, well, hold on a second. When am I going to start getting paid? Mm-hmm. And when am I not? And having the ability to charge a consulting fee for the time and work done is important. And, what will probably surprise most of your listeners, and I know has surprised me at times, is how very willing a wealthy family is to pay that fee. Right? When they see the value, they're happy to pay the fee.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, as with a lot of things, I think as we move away from, advisors being just about numbers on a spreadsheet, how do you demonstrate that value? I mean, that's the challenge a lot of the times, right? When you're dealing with something a little more, sort of less black and white. How do you demonstrate that value so that the clients can see it and then sort of realize what you're doing?
Yeah. And, a lot of it is asking, at least for me, I found it effective for me. Everybody's slightly different, is saying, hey, by the way, what happens if ... Mm-hmm. And they say, oh yeah, I've thought about that. And okay, great. Cool. And then other times they'll say, oh my God, didn't really cross my mind. And you start addressing and talking. So with this specific, prospects, I talk about, okay, so what happens when your son gets married and you're not a huge fan of the spouse, and, you want to make sure that anything that's there, stays in your family and kind of your bloodline as opposed to potentially being diluted. And your son says, no, Mom, I disagree. I want to share anything and everything. Right? We all think about the simple solution of, well, my parents are going to love my spouse, or my parents are going to not love my spouse. And then you set it in a trust. But what if it creates a rift between son and mom, or the child and the parent? How do you address that without making it worse? Can you get out in front of it and have that discussion? So those are the nuances, again, where, to your point, the communications podcast is so important, right?
Like, because even in your example, you have to have already done the footwork to find out that they have a child and they're not crazy about the spouse. Like that's not something that they're going to that's not going to be on the intake sheet.
No, there's no intake sheet for that.
So before you can even make your demonstrate your consulting value on this specific, you have to have already, dug a certain amount of deep into the family to find out, potential pain points before you even start, issue spotting.
Yeah. And actually you bring up a really good point. Like I stopped using a quote unquote intake sheet 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Now, I gather the same information, but I find to have having an open dialogue and saying, okay, tell me a little bit more about yourself. And, like, what do you want to do? And how did you come to own this? And why did you select this piece as opposed to that piece? Oh, right. Wow, you adopted. Is there, like, what happens? All these things, types of conversations, I think when they flow naturally, especially with, wealthier individuals. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, having a naturally flowing conversation, you're going to get much better information and truthful information, in particular when it comes to things that are near and dear to their hearts, than by having a robotic intake sheet. Right? And so, like when I find out about an art collection, when I find out about, like with this prospect, you adopt, like, oh, that's great. Like, what made you choose to adopt? Right? Like, what's the emotion behind it? What was the thinking? What was it? I always wanted a kid, but I can't have kids, like whatever, right? Or I never wanted kids, but I felt so bad for the baby and whatever. For me, I ditched the intake sheet. I find it too robotic. And at the end of the day, if you've been in this business for more than 5 years, you probably have that thing so memorized that you recite it to sleep and you know your spouse. So, having a casual conversation to understand what makes that person tick, what drives them, what made them make the choices that they've made over the course of their lives is far more
Absolutely.
powerful.
I think, one of the great arguments for sort of incorporating estate planning into your practice, if you haven't already, is that it makes those kind of conversations a little easier to start a lot of times. I mean, sometimes, as we mentioned, it can be, all of a sudden asking clients personal questions. I mean, it's what you should be doing, but for a lot of people, they're uncomfortable doing that, just randomly saying, oh, so you're adopted, tell me about it. They're worried that they're going to tell you none of your business. But in the estate planning context, you have to have those those conversations are what it's about. So it's sort of a back door. If you're uncomfortable bringing that stuff up, it's like, oh, but we got to talk about estate planning. So now I have to bring these things up. And it's a more natural way for me to work these into the conversation than to all of a sudden,
One of my favorite questions to ask people is, are you religious or spiritual, and why or why not? It has nothing to do with money, but in fact, it actually really does. Because if the answer is yes, then that leads to a potential gifting strategy to churches or other, religious or spiritual organizations. And you kind of build that into kind of the psyche of that individual. Right? And I promise you, you've interviewed thousands of people, very few advisors bring up religion or spirituality.
It's not one that I hear often, unless specifically asked about.
If it's important to them, we have to know about it.
I think that's a really good place to leave things. If it's important to them, we have to know about it, right? As we're running out of time here, that's sort of a good way to leave it. Oliver, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on. And talking to us. I know I threw
Pleasure.
Just the broadest possible question at you, and I think you handled it with aplomb and took us in an interesting direction. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And to our audience, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of WealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.